Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to another episode of Hot Colds, where the premise of our show is from the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he said a time of patience will come upon a people where holding on to one's religion is like grasping onto hot coals. So we look into the trials and tribulations of Muslims living in the West and looked into solutions. And alhamdulillah, today we have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Asim Aqil, also known from his YouTube channel, Tariq Trekker. Dr. Asim Aqil is married with two kids, alhamdulillah. He has a background in Islamic history for over 20 years, passionate about Islamic history. He started researching in depth about 9 years ago. He started an Islamic history YouTube channel 4 years ago, where he traveled to Muslim countries, where he writes, narrates, produces, and edits videos about how Islam arrived, thrived, and flourished in those regions. So far, he's been to Uzbekistan, Spain, where he has Andalusia series, Turkey, where he has the Ottoman series, and special episodes about Ottoman England coming out this Friday, which is the 11th, August 11th. So it might be out by the time you see this episode. Upcoming series about Portugal and Jordan as well. He has coming. Also planning to go to following countries in the future, such as India, Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Oman, specifically Zanzibar, and the Caucasus. So without further ado, we're going to welcome Dr. Aqil Asim to the program. Welcome, Dr. Aqil. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us. And so today we have a special episode, and it's a little different than what we've done in the other episodes, where we're going to be talking about Andalusia Spain. And I want to talk about this because I think there's many, many lessons that we can take away from this. And I was always, when I learned about Andalusia Spain, I was always passionate about it, always loved it, always wanted to visit. And alhamdulillah, I got to visit in 2016, and there was so many rich lessons you could take away from it. So without further ado, please, Dr. Aqil, if you can start with us, start with us with some of the stories of Spain and how it began.
There's lots of stories about Al-Andalus and how it came about. One of the most interesting stories is actually the story about a certain prince who was actually born and brought up in Syria in an Umayyad palace. But around the year 750 AD, his family were in a bit of problems because the political opponents of the Umayyad royal family, the Abbasids, had just staged a revolution. So he was on the run, fleeing for his life, and the Abbasids chased him halfway across the known world, from the Middle East all the way across North Africa, and he was on the run, hiding in places, and basically he was a pauper. He'd gone from being a prince to being a pauper, a fugitive on the run, and eventually he found himself in modern-day Morocco. And he looked across the straits and he saw Al-Andalus, and he was wondering, shall I go there? Shall I not go there? And eventually decided he'd cross the straits into southern Europe, into modern-day Spain. And when he got there, he was surprised to find there were hundreds of people who were waiting his arrival, waiting to give him the Pledge of Allegiance so he would become the ruler of that land. And within 1 year, he'd actually taken over the land, and he started a dynasty that would last for nearly another 300 years in Islamic Spain, and would become the jewel and the flower of Europe. So this is one of the most interesting stories from Al-Andalus. The particular prince is called Abdurrahman ad-Dakhil, Abdurrahman the immigrant. And but when he got to Al-Andalus, he didn't take over from non-Muslims. He actually took over from Muslims because Islam had already been there for 30, 40 years, which is its own story in its own right.
SubhanAllah. Just on that point, he was running away from assassins, right? And then I think the story was that, when he was at the river in North Africa, and the Abbasids had caught up to him, and they said, "Look, come back, we won't harm you." And he was with his brother, and his brother trusted them, and he went. He's like, "No, don't listen to them." And they killed his brother in front of him, and he continued on leaving. And
but I think the river was in Iraq. It was either the Euphrates or the Tigris. But But I think the issue was that his brother wasn't a good swimmer.
Subhanallah.
So he was going to find it difficult to get across the river anyway. So he turned back, and when the Abbasids got him, they killed him. And he got across the river, and unfortunately saw his brother being killed across the river. But then he knew that he's got to get out of here and get as far away as possible. And 4,000 miles later, he found himself the ruler of Al-Andalus. But he didn't know that at the time he was swimming for his life across the river in the Middle East.
SubhanAllah. We'll talk a little bit about more him later, because there's an interesting hadith that I want to share about that. But so before that, so like the Muslims had already been in Egypt, right? During the time of Umar ibn Khattab, who under Amr ibn al-As, it was opened, and then they noticed that there was room to expand to North Africa, and so that's when this was opened, and then Tariq's coming in the scene when this is already open, correct? So I'm sorry, Abdul Rahman came when this is open. This is opened by another than Tariq. So let's get into the story of Tariq, inshallah. And who is he, and where did he come in the story? And
so Tariq ibn Ziyad is originally someone who's of Berber ethnicity, or also known as Amazigh. So North African, not an Arab, and he was originally a slave after the initial Muslim conquest, but he was freed and he got promoted up the ranks, and he became the governor of Tangiers, which is right across the water from Al-Andalus, which was at that time was ruled by the Visigoths. But in the year 711, an opportunity arose for maybe an incursion into Al-Andalus to conquer the land. And so this man, who was recently converted, led the army, who was comprised of mainly Berbers. And within 5 years of entering, after fighting one decisive battle, they'd conquered virtually the whole peninsula and opened the Visigothic kingdom up to Islam, and they called that kingdom Al-Andalus.
And it reminds me, because the Visigoths, from my understanding, they were not, you could correct me, like they were oppressive to their people, to the locals there in Spain.
They just undergone a recent power struggle. So a king had died who was quite loved by his people, and the throne was usurped by a man called Roderick or Rodrigo, and he was disliked by his people. So at the time that Tariq ibn Ziyad actually entered, he'd left the capital, which is in the center of the land, Toledo, and he'd gone north to suppress some rebellions. When he heard that these people, who they called the Moors, had entered from North Africa, he had to take his army right from the north and bring them all the way down to the south to fight a battle. They were particularly oppressive to Jewish people who were already living in the land, but that would all change when the Muslims arrived.
Yeah, and subhanAllah, it reminds me where, the ayah of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when he said, hadith Qudsi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I forbade oppression upon myself, so I have made it forbidden amongst you, so do not oppress one another. And so the Muslims, they were welcomed in a sense, because they knew the Muslims, that even under the Umayyad dynasty, they had a sense of justice, right? The ayah of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawamin bil qist shuhada lillah. O believers, stand firm for justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it's against your own selves. And so subhanAllah, the Visigoths, they were oppressing the locals, their outside force that came, they were oppressing the locals in Spain, and then the locals, they welcomed them, the Muslims, and because they knew they were just people, and they preferred to be ruled by the Muslims who knew they were just and equitable. And the Visigoths, they were more inclined towards the Muslims than the Visigoths, and they helped them against their oppressors.
Well, you see, if you think about it, the Tariq led a force of 12,000 men to come and take over the land. So when they did take over, they were a small ruling minority, and it would be very hard for 12,000 men to rule the whole peninsula by force. There would have to be some buy-in from the local population, and by and large, from the Muslim-controlled areas of Al-Andalus, you don't really find that there was Christian rebellions against the Muslims. And I think we'll talk about it later, but when some of these Christians converted to Islam and they were now Muslims, then they would rebel against the government. That would happen quite often. But while they were Christian, the vast majority of the time, there was no problems, no rebellion. So that does show you that they must have, the locals at the time when they first came, the Christians, they must have been happy with their rule when they arrived and how they were treated. So we can see the benefits of enacting the prophetic hadith, which you quoted so nicely.
So please continue on with the story. So what happens after that and leading up to Abdul Rahman, and what happens with Abdul Rahman? And
so in all history, there's good things which happen which you can learn from, and then there's bad things that happen that you can learn from. So the Umayyads started having problems across their whole empire. So the empire would run from Spain in one side to Pakistan and India in the east. And so what they found was that, especially in Al-Andalus, there was a problem between the two major Muslim ethnicities, between the Berbers and between the Arabs. And the Berbers and the Arabs actually had a bit of a ding-dong and a bit of a fight, and they had a bit of a revolt. And that's where Abdurrahman, the prince from Damascus, comes into the scene, because when he arrives, he ends up being the right person in the right place at the right time, because he's actually half Berber himself. His mother was a Berber, and he because he was in Damascus, he'd come across many Christians, because obviously the Muslims had taken this over from a Christian empire, and Al-Andalus was full of Christians. And because these two people were fighting, they were looking for someone to be able to unite them. So he could unite the Arabic tribes because he was from a prestigious royal family. He could get the Berbers under his wing because he was half Berber, probably spoke the language, learned it from his mother. And he had experience of living with Christians. So he was the right man in the right place at the right time. And he ended up uniting the fractious kingdom and creating an independent Umayyad Emirates. It was known as initially. But it wouldn't only be the Muslims he would unite. As we've mentioned briefly, the Christians and the Jews, they were all welcome in his society, all treated very well. They did have to pay a special tax. The Muslim paid one sort of tax, if you want to call it, zakah, and the non-Muslims would pay jizya. But they were allowed to practice their religion. They were allowed to trade. They were allowed to live where they wanted, and so on and so forth. But one nice example from Abdurrahman al-Dakhil's time is actually the famous building in Cordoba, the Mosque Cathedral, which is known as today. It's still known as the Mosque Cathedral. And when the Muslims got there with Tariq ibn Ziyad, it was controlled by the Christians. And obviously it was a Christian religious building. It was a church. But the Christians agreed that on a Sunday, they would use it for their mass, and they allowed the Muslims to use it on Friday for Jummah prayer. So they would share the building.
Wow.
But then after Abdurrahman al-Dakhil arrived, and now he's the Emir, he's the Sultan, he's the man in power. He has the power to do what he wanted. If he wanted, he could have just taken the building by force and said it's going to be a mosque. But he had a discussion with them, and he decided, look, we'll buy the building off you if you agree, and then because we would like it to be a mosque. So the Christians agreed. He gave him a fair price. He bought the building, and then he turned it into the mosque that we see today.
Allah. So many different lessons and parables that we could take from that. I mean, just like him just escaping the assassin from the Abbasids, right? Escaping that assassination. It reminds me of, when it reminds me of a hadith in which Abu Abbas, Abdullah ibn Abbas, may Allah be pleased with him, said that one day I was behind the Prophet ﷺ, I was riding on the same mountain. He said, "Oh, young man, I shall teach you some words of advice. Be mindful of Allah, and Allah will protect you." We don't know much about Abdurrahman's character, and as we mentioned before, we were speaking earlier before this podcast, that a lot of the books were burned, and we would have a lot more information than we have today. We have a lot of information today, but we would have had a lot more. But this hadith reminds me of this when I think about Abdurrahman, what happened to him, how he was able to be saved and by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by this persecution and attempt at his life, and then being raised to lead the people and unite these different factions and bring the people together. And it just reminds me, like, if you keep Allah in mind, Allah will protect you. And if you be mindful of Allah, the hadith continues to be mindful of Allah and you will find him in front of you. And if you ask, then ask Allah alone. And if you seek help, then ask help from Allah alone. And know that if a nation were to gather to benefit you with anything, they would not benefit you except that with Allah had already prescribed for you. And if they were to gather together to harm you with anything, they would not be able to harm you except with that Allah had already prescribed against you. The pens have been lifted and the pages have been dried. SubhanAllah. And he just reminds me of, like, he was able to overcome with this, and even if the nations gather together to harm you or benefit you, they can't do nothing except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already written for you.
Yeah, I mean, the Abbasid Khilafah would go on for 500 years after that, after they'd conducted the revolution against the Umayyads. And especially early on, the first few hundred years, they were a very, very powerful state. So he didn't have an army. He didn't have anyone in it. I think he had one of his Christian slaves who was with him, who was very loyal to him, who he liked very much, and they fled together. But yeah, imagine, obviously North Africa now, it's the Sahara Desert you're fleeing across in the north. It's not good conditions. It's a huge continent. He's traveling thousands and thousands of miles with people literally on his tail all the time. I mean, I think there was one story where he came across one of his cousins, I think, while he was in Egypt, a lady cousin. But basically the Abbasids were like just outside the house and they're just about to enter the house. And
wow.
I don't know if I should mention it, but he actually had to hide underneath her abaya to hide from the assassins. So it was literally it was this close from being caught. But yeah, like you said, if all the nations gather against you, if Allah has decreed that they're not going to harm you, then they're not going to harm you. And mashallah, he managed to make his way all the way to Al-Andalus.
SubhanAllah. And with that hadith, there's another narration that the same hadith that says, be mindful of Allah and you will find him in front of you. Recognize and acknowledge Allah in times of ease and prosperity. He will remember you in times of adversity. And know that what has passed you was not going to befall you, and what has befallen you was not going to pass you by. And know that victory comes with patience, relief comes with relief with affliction, and hardship with ease. SubhanAllah, even like just the fact that, like, you said he had a Berber background from his mom's side, and he had an Arab background from his dad's side, and he was able to unite these different factions. It always reminds me of the Prophet ﷺ, because he was, Meccan, Qurashi, from the lineage of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, but his mom's side was from Yemen. He had uncles from Ansar, from Medina. So and then when he went to Medina, he wasn't no stranger. They knew who he was. They knew his lineage. They knew the connection that he, from his mom's side, he was connected to the people of Medina as well. And the same way, and the Prophet ﷺ was able to bring these different fractions together in Medina, right? You had the new Muslims, the Muhajirin, the Ansar. You had the Jews in Medina as well. And he was able to make a constitution with all of them, protecting everyone, protecting their rights, and them working together to protect, themselves from outsiders. Almost in similar fashion, Abdul Rahman, to a lesser extent, is what happened in Spain, as you were mentioning.
Yeah, but both of them fled their original location. Obviously, the Prophet ﷺ fled Mecca. He fled Syria. Both of them were being chased. The Quraysh put a huge bounty on the Prophet ﷺ's head, and everyone was trying to catch him. So the Abbasids were trying to catch Abdurrahman al-Dakhil. And then both of them, when they get to their end destination, they end up bringing the different factions of the society together to make a prosperous country or state or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities there.
Inshallah. So please continue, like, with what happened with Abdurrahman and the following was is going on. People are coexisting together, and the masjid is a beautiful masjid. I went to the Cordoba masjid, and it's a sight of beauty. SubhanAllah, it's really amazing what they were able to create in that structure, and almost like the pillars and the arcs are like the masjid and Masjid al-Nabawi, but just different colors.
Yeah, Masjid al-Nabawi, they copied Cordoba Mosque. which is not the other way around. People think, oh, Cordoba
Yeah,
copied Medina. No, no, no. Medina copied Cordoba.
yeah, it came afterwards, so that's just
Yeah.
simple fact of history. So please continue. So what happens in Andalusia, Spain? How does how's the society there? How are people living afterwards?
So, so yeah, you've got different members of the society. So you could classify the citizen to maybe 4 or 5 categories. The first category would be Arab Muslim, which is self-explanatory. The second category would be Berber Muslim, again self-explanatory, and these people would be the minority of the society. And then the next category would be Jews, again self-explanatory, people who have the Jewish faith, but they live in the Iberian Peninsula, now known as Al-Andalus. The fourth category would be Christians, and it's very interesting because they were called Moz Arabs. Now, the term Moz Arab is actually taken from an Arabic word, and the Arabic word is Musta'arab, and Musta'arab means Arabized. So these Christians, they kept their religion, they remained as Christians, but they were called Arabized. Why? Because they adopted many things from Arabic or Berber or Muslim culture. So maybe the dress, or they started speaking in Arabic, or certain foods. But they adopted many things from the Muslims. So they were called Musta'arab, which they pronounced as Mozarab. And that's what they're known as today, which is very interesting because I mean, you live in America and I live in the UK, and you can see that there's always people coming to these two countries from many other countries around the world. But do you see Americans and British people copying the foreigners' culture? Or do you see the foreigners coming and copying the American culture? Which one do you see?
I mean, usually they're adapting the Western culture, but you have
I'm not talking about Muslims.
where people may accept the religion, and yeah.
I'm not talking about Muslims coming to UK or America. I'm talking about anybody from all around the world. They'll come to America, or they come to the UK. But do the Americans copy all the foreigners' culture, or do the foreigners copy American culture eventually?
The foreigners usually just copy the American culture. Yeah.
Well, this is the other way around. Now in Al-Andalus, a minority of Muslims come across, but the majority are Christians, and many of them are adopting things from Muslim culture. So this means you can see you don't copy people who you don't like. You don't mimic people who you don't like. You don't copy and mimic and adopt things from people who you hate. So this shows they must have had some very, very good relations if you want to dress like them, you want to speak their language, and you want to do all these things. So
yes, I heard they used to wear the gowns, like the thobes, like the robes, like the Muslims.
I think that was common. All like the Romans used to wear things like that as well. So I think
I believe that like the Abbasids may have taken that from like the Greeks, and there was a lot of things they took from the Greek, the way they structure their fiqh, and but yeah, they like the long coat thobes, and because before what I believe they used to wear the ones up to the knees, and be able to ride horses and go to battle with them. But yeah, we're wearing the thobes, the fact. And was this the same time that Europe was in the Dark Ages?
Yeah. So the Dark Ages is also sometimes called the medieval period. It corresponds from the time when the Roman Empire fell in the 400s to roughly around 1453, some people say. So about 1,000 years. And it's referred to as the Dark Ages because in Europe, not necessarily the rest of the world, but in Europe especially, knowledge, learning, study of the sciences, philosophy, arts, and we're lagging behind. Whereas in the Muslim world, all these things were really, really flourishing. So Europe might have been in the Dark Ages, but the Muslim world, the Middle East, the Abbasids, in particular, were certainly not in the Dark Ages. And one interesting thing about the Muslim world at this time was that if something was invented in the East, it would make its way to the West. And if something was invented in the West, it would make its way to the East. There was no restriction on knowledge, or we're keeping this to ourselves. It would be free to flow. So many things flowed from the East across North Africa into Al-Andalus, and then from Andalus, it would spread eventually to Europe.
Wow. And we talk about knowledge such as geometry, optometry, astrology. agriculture. I remember seeing like the agricultural wheels that send the water through the different farmland. And actually, it was an interesting brother I met there, Yusuf. He's a local Spaniard from the Andalus area, from the south, and he's Muslim. His father became Muslim, and they said we can tell with the farmland, the olive trees, when were they grown, prior to the Muslims coming, when were they grown when the Muslims were here, and when were they grown after. I'm like, well, how? And then he's like, well, before the Muslims came, they were just planting the olive trees there anywhere. And when the Muslim came, they had a structure. With the agriculture structure, they would have the same amount of distance between each olive tree, a certain amount of feet on each side, separating them. Each one having its its space, its water, in order to produce many olives. And then when Muslims were no longer in control, and they were no longer there, and they were essentially killed or tortured or pushed away or enslaved. And we'll get into that, but they became greedy and started planting the trees much closer to each other. So subhanAllah, even simple things like that's like still exist today. You can tell the difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things which combined within the Muslims in Al-Andalus to produce this. The first thing is that the people who came, who are an Arab or Berber ethnicity, these are people who have come largely from the desert. And when you're from the desert, one thing you don't have much of is water. So when you get water, you want to use it for the best of your ability. You don't waste it. So when people come to Al-Andalus with this mentality, and Andalus has got lots of rivers and oceans very close by and large mountains. When people come with this mentality to Al-Andalus and water is just everywhere, it's like, wow, what can we do? Look what we can do with all this. But the other interesting thing was, to get to Al-Andalus, the Muslims have had to conquer the Byzantine Empire. And from the Byzantines, they learned certain agricultural techniques. So the knowledge of these techniques, in combination with their attitude to water, which they've come from with the desert, and now they're in Al-Andalus and there's water everywhere, they started making lots of channels to bring waters from the mountains. So all of a sudden, all these cities had running water. All of a sudden, these barren land. Sorry, barren land.
I was just gonna say, and yeah,
barren land all of a sudden had loads of water, so they could now start planting all these crops. But the upshot of this, when you start planting crops and food becomes plentiful, that means your society can thrive. That means you can sustain bigger populations. That means your cities become bigger. That means your cities become more prestigious. That means if there's ever a battle, you've got more people to fight the battle, and so on and so forth. So just a few little things combined to produce such a massive effect in Andalus.
I was just going to add to that when you're talking about the water. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, don't waste water. Even if you're at a ocean, don't waste water. So, so I'm just applying that hadith. And then look, like what you mentioned, how it brings up the prosperity of a nation and the people. And wow, it's amazing. So let's get yeah.
Even to this day, I read an article a couple of years ago about how people have uncovered an old water system somewhere in the mountains, and they've kind of just refurbished it or put it back together again, and it's from Muslim times, and they're using it to bring water to the villages. Even till this day, what the Muslims did in terms of agriculture and water channels is still benefiting Spain till this day, 1,300 years later. Sorry, brother, you wanted to move on?
Yeah. I was just gonna say continue. We can continue. Like, where are we at now? So where are we now at the stage of like Muslims in Spain? Are we at the Khilafah of Cordoba yet, or?
So I think importantly, before that, if we think about the 800s, so between 800 AD and 900 AD, there starts to be a big swing in the demographics of the population. So when the Muslims first arrived, they're a ruling minority, but slowly over the 800s, the local population, who were either Visigothic or Carthaginian or other ethnicities, they started to adopt the religion of Islam. So you can say towards the end of the 800s, about 40% of the population was Christian, 40% was Muslim, and the rest were Jewish. So that's a big swing within 150 years, when only a few thousand people first come over for the conquest, to now the Muslims and the Christians in terms of their numbers are the same after about 150 years. But interestingly, when these Christians started converting to Islam, they actually then found they had a problem with the Muslim central government in Cordoba, because now that they're Muslim, technically they should not be paying jizya tax anymore, because now they're Muslim. But the Umayyad rulers, the Umayyad emirs in Cordoba, continued to request them to pay the jizya tax, because they wanted the money, they wanted the revenue to come in so they could use it for state expenditure. So what started to happen was a lot of the new converted Muslims in the peripheries around Cordoba, which is in the center, started to rebel at different points in time, and the Umayyad rulers then had to start putting down these rebellions. But interestingly, these people, they never, even though they still had to pay the jizya and they were upset with the central government, they never went back. They never left Islam. They all stayed upon Islam and rebelled against the ruler. And this led to some major problems where at the beginning of the 900s, so just after 900 AD, it looked like Al-Andalus was about to collapse, because virtually everyone had kind of rebelled, were doing their own thing, and were closing in on Cordoba. And then all of a sudden, a certain young man appeared in Cordoba and did things which nobody thought he might be able to do.
So who was that young man?
Who was that young man? He was called Abdurrahman as well. But so Abdurrahman al-Dakhil, the one who fled the Abbasids and came halfway across the known world, he's Abdurrahman the first. But this particular Abdurrahman was Abdurrahman the third. And he came to power as a young man in his early 20s in Cordoba, and lots of problems all around the Iberian Peninsula. Everyone rebelling, everyone thinking now it's our time to get a piece of the pie. And very, very skillfully, for such a young man, he had so much wisdom and so much political insight as to how to deal with all these different situations. Slowly but surely, he started winning people over, either by asking them to become part of his political setup, or sometimes going to war with other people, or sometimes paying other people off. And slowly but surely, he was able to unite the whole of Al-Andalus, or what was the Muslim-controlled parts anyway, back into one cohesive unit again. And he even managed to start taking tribute again from the kingdoms in the north, because when the Cordoba Emirate was weak, they decided, we're not going to pay you any tribute money. But by the time he'd united everything, they started paying tribute money, and then he also established very good relations with them as well. So, and that's when he decided, you know what, we're no longer an emirate. I'm going to declare Al-Andalus a caliphate, and put ourselves as or say that we are the actual true leaders of the Muslim world. So he went from being, he came in a young man, and he ruled for about 50 years. And he came in at a time when the ground was shaking under his feet. By the time he died 50 years later, he'd made Al-Andalus again one of the most prosperous states in the world, and put it on a plate for his son to take over from him.
And why was that so significant that he did that? You know, moving from an emirate to claiming a khalifa, and a khalifa meaning like a vicegerent, sometimes to manage the affairs of the earth, of the land.
So this shows that although he's got problems in Al-Andalus, which is kind of like the far west of the Muslim world, the peripheries, he's still got his eye on the rest of the Muslim world. So at the time, the Abbasid Caliphate was starting to shrink and lose a lot of power. And at the same time that was happening, a new dynasty had come to power in Egypt, separate from the Abbasids, called the Fatimids. And they were a Shia Ismaili dynasty. So now there was two in the Middle East, and they were weaker compared to the previous Abbasid Caliphate, which was a lot bigger and a lot more powerful. And for him, as well, he thought that actually this right was for his family, because eventually the Abbasids had taken over from his family, the Umayyads who were ruling from Damascus, the whole Muslim world from Damascus. So once he'd united Al-Andalus, he started looking further afield, and he wanted to project himself more internationally. So you could say, was Al-Andalus really the strongest Muslim state at the time? Was it really the leader of the whole Muslim world? My personal opinion is no. I don't think it was. I think it was probably more of a political decision that he wanted to put himself on the map and make himself known and get people talking about him and so on and so forth, more rather than actually being the most prestigious, preeminent Muslim polity on the planet.
If I'm not mistaken, this is probably like the height of the Muslims in Andalus, right? Correct. And he built the city from scratch. I forget the name of the city.
Yeah, everybody knows Cordoba. On the outskirts of Cordoba, there is another city which is called Madinatul Zahra.
Yes,
which is built from scratch. Now, have you been there?
I have. It's a quite piece of work. What it used to be and what it is now.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because obviously excavations are taking place, but they think they've only excavated about 10% of the city. So what you and I saw when we went is only about 10% of what the city was. Wow. But one of the reasons why he built it is in the early 750s, the Abbasids made Baghdad. So they made a city from scratch, and it's their caliphal capital. And then the Fatimids, when they take over Egypt, they made Cairo, which is their caliphal capital. And he didn't want to be outdone. So he made his own capital, his own city. He wanted to be just as great as the rest of them. So yeah, on the outskirts of Cordoba, he made an administrative capital, which was the seat of his government. And it was called Madinatul Zahra. And in its time, when ambassadors would come from all around the world, they were absolutely dazzled by this caliphal city with its palace. I think he kept lions in there, running water, fountains. And he used to play some trick with mercury. So when ambassadors would come and they'd enter his main hall, he'd have some mercury somewhere on the floor, and he'd tell them to come at a certain time of the day, and the sun would shine on it, and lights would go everywhere. Wow. In all these different directions, and no one had seen this before. So they would kind of think, who's this guy we've come to see? Has this guy got special powers or something? So yeah, he was very wise and very, very clever from these points of view.
Yeah, the depictions of what it was, what they believed what it looked like is just amazing, just stunning. The palaces and all the different areas for the army, for the advisors, for the lawmakers, for the families, for the women, for the children, for the common work folk. I SubhanAllah, I was thinking about earlier, and I mentioned it now, like, we know in Surah Al-Kahf, the fitna, the trial of power, right? And we know the good example of that is the Qur'anain, who had this power, but he used it the right way, right? And, just having all this around you, it was believed that it got to the point where he didn't even make, I believe it was like he didn't make Salat al-Jum'ah. And there was a couple of times where it happened that he didn't pray the Jum'ah prayer, the Friday prayer.
Abdurrahman III.
Yes, I believe it was Abdurrahman III.
Okay.
And then the scholars of the time told him, you have to go back to the Masjid of Cordoba and retake your Shahada. And then his guards were ready to handle this scholar, this alim. They said, no, leave him alone. He's right. I shouldn't have missed khutbah. I shouldn't have missed the Jum'ah prayer. So they're being indulged in this, and it was just amazing policy. And for those that are watching and they haven't been there, describe what it is now. What does it look like? What's there now?
It's there's a lot of rubble. There's a few walls, but I think you have to give a lot of credit to the Spanish authorities, because they've got all the experts in, the archaeologists, the historians, and they've made a museum not so far away from it, and they've managed to reconstruct and make 3D videos of what it would have looked like they've managed to do this from the foundation. So before you go, watch the video, and you'll realize what it used to be, and then when you go and you see the ruins of it, you'll think of it in a completely different way. But one interesting thing you said there about the fitna of power. So this man, he was in power for 50 years, and he had wealth, he had lots of women, he had lots of power. And these are generally the things that the men try to fight over or strive for or want. Power, money, wives, whatever. And he had it all. But he said at the end of it, he famously said at the end of his life, throughout all this, I've only had 14 days of true happiness.
Wow.
This is a famous saying of his, because he had the power. He had all this to deal with, but it was a massive headache for him. And it was so much of a headache that he admits on his deathbed, I've only had 14 days of true happiness. Imagine the equivalent of him now would be, a billionaire, living in, the most grandest palace in the whole world, being the most powerful man in the whole world. And you'd never imagine that a man like that would say, yeah, I've only been happy for 14 days. But that's the fitna of power.
It comes with its trials, its tribulations, its patience, and illa ma rahma rabbi, whom Allah has mercy on, and to read like the examples of like those prophets who did have that did have that power, right? The Prophet ﷺ didn't indulge in these things, or Dawood alayhi salam, Sulaiman alayhi salam, they had these things and they used it in Allah's cause. So subhanAllah. So now we're getting into what happens afterwards, right? This is like, I guess we could say, the beginning of somewhat of the downfall, but then there's an inspiration that comes up. So where are we now in the story, and what lessons can we learn?
So one of the great things that Abdurrahman III did was those problems that were emerging between the Muslims and the new Muslims, and between Arab and Berber. He was very clever that he managed to reunite them all. So all of them had a seat at his new caliphal capital, Madinatul Zahra. All of them were integrated into his political system. And people who were his opponents before became his ardent supporters. And he also made some very good institutions, whether they be institutions of knowledge, institutions of administration, which helped the society really, really come together and function very well. But unfortunately, his son came to power, and his son carried on. He was called Al-Hakam II. But he died, and his son, who was called Hisham, who was Hisham II, was very young. He was only 6 years old. And that's when another character who was kind of like, he's called Al-Hajib Al-Mansur. That's his title. Al-Hajib is like, which is kind of like a minister or a prime minister or a chief minister, something like that. And Al-Mansur means the victorious. His real name is Muhammad ibn Abi Amir. And he was someone who was very, how can we say, he was very skilled in how to maneuver his way through the Umayyad court to get to the top position. And eventually he became the person who's going to oversee the rule of this young 6-7-year-old boy, Hisham II. And basically he made all the decisions. But when he started making all the decisions, he started concentrating, excuse me, he started concentrating all the power in himself, rather than in all these different institutions, rather than the Umayyad royal family. All the power started coming to him, and him only. So when he died, basically what held Al-Andalus together died as well. And all the old problems which existed between the factions before, between the Arabs, between the Berbers, between the newly converted Muslims, who were called Muwallad Muslims. All these things resurfaced. And as a result of that, soon after he died, everyone started fighting with each other. And Al-Andalus broke up into what's known as the Ta'ifa period, where they didn't have one emirate, they didn't have one caliphate on the peninsula. They had 10, 12, 13, 14 different mini states, each with its own little king. And every king is fighting for his own throne and to keep his position, and sometimes trying to do dirty tactics to throw someone else off the throne and take over his mini kingdom. So little kings fighting over little kingdoms, which eventually would have big consequences.
SubhanAllah. There was a previous episode we talked about individuals struggling with, like, certain sadness and depression, and fitting up being a lone sheep, and the shaitan loves the lone sheep, right? And this is like on a communal level, where it's like the fitna of tribalism, right? Each one focusing on their own tribe, their own mamluk, their own kingdom, their own masjid, and having just this me kind of like myself, and then it's kind of my community, and that's what led to like them being easily being like wiped out and killed by these Christian kingdoms, and unfortunately some of them even joined the Christian kingdoms that were fighting other Muslims. And subhanallah, and it just reminds me, like, the only way to success is made clear to us in Surah Al-Asr, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by time, wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, that by time that all mankind in a state of loss, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat, except those who believe and do righteous good deeds. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, and they enjoin upon truth, and they enjoin upon patience. That's the only way to success. And subhanAllah, they were all focused about themselves, not really enjoining on them, on truth and patience, and then subhanAllah, all that fitna that came out of it, and the trials and fighting.
Yeah, I think is the hadith Yadallahi ala al-Jama'ah.
Yes.
So
Allah's hand is in the congregation, and
exactly. So sticking, you might know better than me. In this hadith, Yadallahi ala al-Jama'ah, does Jama'ah mean congregation or just people coming together in any circumstances?
Oh, I mean, that's the definition of congregation: people coming together.
Yes.
Any kind of group of Muslims that Allah's with them. They're together.
Yes. It's not only specific; it includes prayer, but it's not specific to prayer. It could be anything.
Yes.
So here, this is more political unity, or this is more different factions of Muslims. Some Arab, some Berber, some European ethnicities who have just converted to Islam or been Muslims for 1 or 2 generations. Yadallahi ala al-Jama'ah. But when that went, then the trials and tribulations come with big consequences.
And then it reminds me of the hadith, the ayah in Quran where Allah says, don't take the disbelievers believers as awliya, as protectors besides the Muslims. And there's nothing wrong with working with non-Muslims, etc. And we saw that in coexistence. Yeah, they live together, they help each other, they work together. But when it comes to a point where you're seeking protection from those other than the believers, and then it's against the believers for material gain, this just shows you it's just like you're going to a downward path. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because the first major Muslim city to fall out of the hand of Muslims was Toledo in the year 1085. And the story goes that the ruler of Toledo, the little city-state of Toledo and the surrounding countryside, he was very worried that one of the other Muslim kings further in the south was going to march up and conquer his little ta'ifa. So what did he do? He actually contacted a friend of his who was a Christian king in the north, who was called Alfonso the Brave. I think he's Alfonso the Sixth, maybe. He was the king of Castile, and he said to him, "Come down and help protect my kingdom." So he came with his army, and actually the Muslim ruler realized that he's a lot weaker than his. They were good friends, these two rulers, the Muslim ruler of Toledo and the Alfonso of Leon Castile in the north. And eventually he actually decided, you know what, I'll just turn over the keys of the city to you. And he gave him the keys of the city. Peaceful transition of power, no fighting. Alfonso said to him, "Look, I don't want to take the city like this. Let's stage a fake siege so it looks like I conquered the city. So I get more prestige with my people back home. So the Muslim ruler said, okay, fine, no problem. But again, what put this Muslim ruler of Toledo, which is in the center of Spain, what put him in this predicament? What put him in this situation? He was scared that another Muslim ruler from the south was going to come and conquer him, so he had to go and ask for help from someone else, which is a Christian ruler in the north, which led to the fall of the first major city, which is Toledo, and that was the first domino. But these dominoes didn't fall quickly. These dominoes would take 50, 100 years to eventually completely fall. But it was the first domino, the first major city to be lost from the hands of Muslims in Spain in 1085, I think.
Yes, so then we get into the Murabitun, and then later on to the Muwahidun. So let's get into them as well, and let's before we end the program, let's get into the Murabitun and the Muwahidun and the Emirates of Granada as well, inshallah.
So these weak kingdoms in Al-Andalus, which may be numbered sometimes 8, sometimes 10, sometimes 12, sometimes 14, 15. Once Toledo fell to this Alfonso the Brave, Alfonso the Sixth, they all started getting very worried, because a bigger, more powerful state is coming into existence in the north, and they're little ones in the south. So they thought, we need some help here. So they actually called the ruler of a new dynasty, which had just come into being in North Africa, who were called the Almorabitun. Their empire was actually quite big. It was spanning from Tangiers in the north all the way down to West Africa. So you're talking thousands of miles, maybe 1,000, 2,000 miles across the Sahara Desert. And they called him to come to Al-Andalus to help them fight against Alfonso, and keep him away from conquering the rest of the kingdoms in the south of Al-Andalus. One of the key players who wanted to bring him over was the ruler of the Ta'if of Seville. He was called Al-Mut'amid ibn Abbad. And just so you can learn about the mentality of some of these people at the time, he had some sons, and he would put one of his son ruling this little town in his capital was Seville, and he had the surrounding countryside, and he'd put his son in this little castle to rule this bit and look after it, and another one here, another one here. And he told his sons, I'm going to call the Almorabitun across, the ruler, their leaders, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, legendary man. I'm going to call him across to help us against this Alfonso in the north. And some of his sons turned around and said to him, why are you doing this for? Because, if he comes here, he's just going to take over and you're going to lose your kingdom. And he turned around to his sons and he said, I'm not going to be the one who loses the kingdom, this kingdom from Muslim hands. And I would rather be a camel herder for him in Morocco, in North Africa, rather than being a shepherd of pig for Alfonso in the north. So I'm going to call him over. So, but you can see the mentality of his sons who are going to get the kursi after him. That don't call him over, because we won't inherit the throne. We want the throne. But at that moment in time, his kingdom is weak and it's probably going to get conquered. But luckily, he at this point in time, Al-Mut'amid ibn Abbad, he wasn't thinking like that, and he decided to call over Al-Murabitun, led by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who is a legendary man. He was 80 years of age when he got the call from Al-Andalus, come and help us. Now, just think of any 80-year-old man that you know in your local community. What do they do all day? They probably sat down on a sofa. They probably walk with a walking stick. They're probably very weak and feeble men. They probably don't want any headache. Yeah? Imagine that man in your mind now who just thinks, you know what? I'm going across. I'm gonna go and take the battle to these guys, and I'm going to conquer this kingdom. I'm going to save the day for all these Muslims, and I'm going to be the man. Can you imagine that?
I mean, that's precisely the fact. The people that age are like, they don't want to be bothered, or at best they go to the masjid at that age and they're making their prayers. But the fact that he was able to do that reminds me what the hadith of Prophet that he said if the sun rises from the west and a tree sapling is in your hand, plant it. Like, even though he's 80 years old, it looks like it might have, we don't know what's going to happen with the future of the Muslims in Andalus. still, do your good.
Yeah, and you might know the verse better than me. I think in Surah Toba, where it says, "Go forward, whether light or heavy." Yeah,
Yes.
whether you're strong or whether you're weak, whether you're able or not so able. And I think one Sahaba called Abdullah ibn Maktoum, who was actually blind, when he heard this verse that go forward whether you're weak or strong, or whether you're able or not able, he decided, you know what, I'm going to go out on this on an expedition. And all the other Sahaba said, look, what are you going to do? You're blind. How are you going to help us? How are you going to be used in the battle? And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll stand next to the armaments. I'll stand next to this camp. Yeah. And all the enemy, they're far away. They don't know that I'm blind. They'll think that I'm a guard and I'm guarding it, and they won't come. But I'll just stand next to it. So I'm going to be of some use. Even though I'm blind, I'm going to make myself useful. So mashallah, amazing mentality of a blind man. And Yusuf ibn Tashfin, amazing mentality of a very old man. Something that I don't think all the 80-year-olds we know, or all the old people we know, you wouldn't expect that from them. You wouldn't expect their mind to work in that way. But this man, it did. He crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Al-Andalus, and all the remaining Ta'ifa kingdoms came under the control of the Al-Murabitun, North African Berber dynasty, who saved the day, reunited Al-Andalus, and joined it with their own kingdom in North Africa. So yeah, a new player was on the scene. Unfortunately for the Al-Murabitun, they're now ruling two different land masses. They're ruling North Africa, and they're also ruling Al-Andalus. And they were very different. And they did find it difficult to do. And they took their eye off the ball of what was happening in North Africa, which led to some political opponents in North Africa gaining a lot of ground. They were called the Al-Muwahhidun. And you can say they used a lot of religious rhetoric against the Al-Murabitun. And also they started telling people the Al-Murabitun, they've gone soft, now that they've come to power and they've conquered this, they're living like this, and so on and so forth. So a lot of it was political rhetoric. But anyway, they managed to start taking land from the Al-Murabitun in North Africa. And eventually they conquered all of North Africa from the Al-Murabitun. And then in 1147 AD, they managed to cross over into Al-Andalus, and very quickly they united all of the Al-Murabitun territory in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain, under them. And so they were, again, a North African Berber dynasty, the second one, which came in to carry the flag in Al-Andalus and keep Al-Andalus safe and secure, and win battles against the kingdoms in the north, who at this point in time, a real energy had come into them to think, you know what, we need to try and conquer these kingdoms in the south and these Muslim kingdoms in the south. And the reason for that was this time period was the time period of the Crusades. So in 1099, the Crusaders take Jerusalem, and Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi in 1189 retakes Jerusalem. So like 90-year period. And slap bang in the middle of this period is 1147, when the Al-Muwahhidun enter Al-Andalus. So when people think of the Crusades, they often think about the Middle East and Salah ad-Din and Richard the Lionheart and things like that, which is fine, all well and good. But what a lot of people don't understand or neglect is that Al-Andalus actually was the second theater of the Crusades. And the Pope was calling on the small kingdoms, Christian kingdoms in the north, to unite to go and fight the Al-Muwahhidun, and they were sending knights from the rest of Europe. And the Al-Muwahhidun did very well because all these people were ganging up, and they were just one dynasty. And for large periods of time, they managed to keep on winning battle after battle of battle and keeping Al-Andalus safe until...
MashaAllah, it's beautiful that they were able to do that. Because if you think about, like, right, the premise of our show, like Hot Coals, right? You've got, holding on to one's religion despite the challenges. And, I know it was definitely the instance with the Pope and during the times of the Crusades, especially towards Jerusalem. There were a lot of Islamic propaganda was coming out at that time. Drawings were coming out. They didn't have media and TV like we do today, but drawings were coming out of, these false images of Muslims, defacing and defecating on religious places in Jerusalem, which was definitely not the fact. Since the time of Umar ibn Khattab, when he first entered Jerusalem, he made sure to keep their religious, institutions intact and leave them alone, and preserve, let people preserve their religious spaces. And so, like during the times of the Crusade, this time they talk about Salahuddin Ayyubi, and it's probably the same thing with the Crusades going into Spain. Really depicting this very, false narrative of Muslims as we do have today, right? False narratives and propaganda and media. I mean, some of that has died down after, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and the end of that, but it's still something that's ongoing. It's still something it just changed the way it looks, but it's the same kind of fabric.
Yeah, I think whatever era you're in, if you're wanting to go to war against another nation, you have to convince your nation that you should be going to war against these people, and these people are bad people and they deserve to be fought. So in that situation, I think most countries will be doing it. Like now in Russia and Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's going to be saying we need to go in and do X, and he'll be coming up with very interesting reasons of why the Russians should go in. The Ukraine and the West is saying something else about Vladimir Putin. So there's always a propaganda that goes into a war, into a conflict, to dehumanize or at least make the other side look as if they are inferior or wrong and deserve to be fought and conquered. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on at the time. But the Al-Muwahhidun, to their credit, they stood firm. They fought lots of good battles. One downfall of the Al-Muwahhidun is that when it came to a pitched battle, so a pitched battle is when you're on a battlefield and you've got one army here and the other army here, and they come and they fight. In the pitched battle, they were brilliant. You couldn't beat them. But when it came to actually conquering new land, now you've got to go and you've got to put a city under siege, and you need siege techniques. They weren't so good at that. So they were very good at winning a battle, and then the Christian kingdoms would go back to the north and the Muslim kingdom would go back to the south. But then the state of play would remain the same. The borders would remain the same. If they developed their skills at siege warfare, they may have been able to go further, but it wasn't in their capability. So the trick for the Al-Muwahhidun was they just had to keep on winning all the battles. The moment that they lost a battle, there's going to be problems.
So they lose a famous battle in 1212, and they fled to North Africa, and which goes on to, Cordoba and Seville fall into Catholic states. And then the last kingdom of Granada in the south begins. So we can get into like the closing, the end of what happens there.
So yeah, in the year 1212, very easy date for everyone to remember. A big battle called the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa takes place at a very interesting point in the geography of Spain, and it involves the Christian kingdom in the north, so the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, Navarre, and lots of Crusader knights as well are involved in this battle, and the Al-Muwahhidun on the other side. And as a result of the battle, the Al-Muwahhidun lost, and the Christians then, if you imagine Spain, there's a mountain range in the middle of the country, or just south of the middle. It's called the Sierra Morena Mountains. And because they'd won this battle, they'd managed now to creep down a little pass, and they'd entered into flat land, basically very easy for an army to transverse straight across. And all they had to do now was march down these valleys, and they'd come to Cordoba and they'd come to Seville. And about 20 years after the battle, they conquered Cordoba. 10 years after that, they conquered Seville. So by 1246 or 1248, the two main cities, the two main Muslim cities in Al-Andalus, Cordoba and Seville, had been conquered. And at this point in time, the Al-Muwahhidun have fled back to North Africa. They thought there's no point in staying here now. Let's just go back home and just rule our kingdom. So the Muslims in Al-Andalus were left with no major cities, with no political leaders, and major armies who'd entered the south now, and they were ready to conquer everywhere. But all of a sudden, a man who was not very well known, whose family had never ruled anywhere, started making some very interesting political moves in some mountains further south, and he managed to conjure up for himself a little dominion in the south called the Kingdom of Granada, or the Emir of Granada, and from nowhere he created a dynasty which lasted 250 years somehow, and obviously this particular dynasty are the ones who built the Alhambra, which is still there for everyone to see today, and they would end up being the last Islamic dynasty on the Iberian Peninsula, on what is modern day Spain and Portugal.
And in the Alhambra is a beautiful, it's like a city within a city, and it's beautiful. And I remember seeing the phrase all over the walls, right? And I even got a souvenir of it in my fridge. La qaraba illa billah. You know, there's no overturner, no overcomer except by the will of Allah. Except by Allah. لا غالبة إلا بالله.
لا غالبة. لا غالبة إلا لله.
إلا لله.
يا غالب. as in غلبهم. لا غالبة إلا الله. Yes. It's all over the walls of the Alhambra, and the Alhambra initially, when you look at it, there's different parts to it. So obviously everyone goes and sees the palace.
Yes.
What's called the Nasrid palaces. But what they don't realize is actually first and foremost, it's a defensive fortress. In terms of they made the fortress bit, the citadel bit, first, what's called the Al-Qasaba. And then after 100 years of this Alhambra being in existence, and they've kind of stabilized the situation and they're not so scared anymore, that's when they build the Alhambra, a nice palace in the middle, which everyone goes to see and take pictures, but which tells you a story. And that story is that these people were all about hanging on, trying to just exist, trying not to get conquered. So it's all about defense. And once after 100 years, once everything was a little bit stable, they thought, we'll build a nice palace now. So, but that tells you a lot about the state of the kingdom. They were always on the edge. They were always worried about being conquered, and everything in the mind was, how do we keep on existing? How do we keep these kingdoms in the north at bay? And they used very interesting political maneuvers to do that, inside and outside of their realm.
Right. So take us into the end of, quote unquote, Islam in Spain, Islam in Andalus. I mean, alhamdulillah, there's still Muslims there. There's a masjid across from the Granada on the other side of the city, of the town. We can see the Granada from there, the Alhambra from there. But what happens in Granada until the eventual, just complete, the overall, eviction of the Muslims in the area?
So there was lots of internal problems with the Emirate of Granada. Within the Emirate of Granada, rulers came and rulers went very, very quickly. There was one man called Muhammad IX, and he ruled the Emirate of Granada actually 4 times. So because the coups kept occurring, and he'd get thrown out of the palace, and then he'd do a coup and get back in the palace, and then the coup would happen and he'd get thrown out of the palace. So I can't think of any other ruler in history who had 4 separate goals at ruling a kingdom. But Muhammad IX of the Nasrid dynasty certainly did that. But in the end, again, it was infighting. So there was a man ruling called Abu Hassan Ali, and his son was called Abu Abdullah, and he's also known as Muhammad the 12th. And basically, it's basically a family feud. The mother was called Aisha al-Hurriya, and she got very annoyed with Abul Hassan Ali, her husband, the ruler of the Emirate of Granada, because he'd taken one of his concubines as a second wife, and he banished Aisha, the first wife, from the palace, from the Alhambra palace. He sent her across to the other side of the valley and to live over there. So she decided, she was very active before this in the courts. She was a lady. She was actually the daughter of Muhammad IX, who ruled the Emirate of Granada 4 times. So politics was in her blood, and she wanted to get back in the palace and be active in politics again. So she thought she'd use her son. So she got her son to do a coup over his father, and then he came to power. He turned out to be not so good. He went on he came to power. His father was sidelined. He got caught on a raid into Christian territory in the north, and basically the Ferdinand and Isabella, the Christian king and queen, took him captive and said, "Look, we'll let you go on one condition, and that is you help us to conquer some areas of the land which is ruled by the Emir of Granada. So, for example, we want to conquer the port city of Malaga." And they said, if we do that, we'll let you go, and then we'll let you go back, and you can be the emir of Granada and the little area around it. So you'd have a very small kingdom, but just Granada and what was around it. And he agreed, but they made him give his children to them as security. So his children went to the Christian king and queen to be kept, just to make sure he was going to enact the plan and he wasn't going to go back on it. So when he gets released after captivity, he comes back to the Emir of Granada, but his uncle is now in power. He was Muhammad the 13th, known as, I think it's Al-Zaghalal, I think he was called, his nickname. So he launches a rebellion against his uncle. His uncle realizes time's up, and his uncle flees to North Africa, and he goes and he takes the Granada again, and he's very happy in the fancy palace. But Ferdinand and Isabella, the king of the Christian kingdom in the north, have taken Malaga, the port city in the south, and they're now closing in on Granada like this. So eventually they decided, you know what, we don't really need this weak guy. We can take him easily. So they said, right, we're going to put the Alhambra Palace under siege. So it was, the thing is about the Alhambra, it's a very sophisticated thing, and very sophisticated things are very delicate. They can break very easily. You just need to know the right spot to attack, and you'll break it. And the Alhambra, it's on a hill, and its water source comes from the Sierra Nevada mountains, about 20 or 30 miles away. And they had one water source, which was about 20 miles long, which brought water all the way to the palace. So without firing a cannon, without sending any horses into battle, all they did was they cut the water source. And they waited. A few days later, the game was over, and he had to hand over the keys of the palace to Ferdinand and Isabella, and they walked in, and they made that their new residence. And so that was in 1492. So the last kingdom in Spain, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, had fallen. And just to put it into perspective, what a big deal this was for Ferdinand and Isabella. They decided, so these people became the king and queen of Spain. Madrid was not sort of up and coming city then, but before that it was Toledo and other cities in the north. They'd already had Cordoba for 200 years. And I think Toledo was the religious capital. But they decided that when they died, they wanted to be buried in Granada, nowhere else. So if you go to Granada today, everyone goes to the Alhambra. But if you can, go down to the cathedral in Granada, which used to be the Granada Grand Mosque. They knocked it down and they made a cathedral there. But in there, Ferdinand and Isabella have decided to be buried there because they wanted their names to be always associated together with the conquering of Granada. And they're the ones who completed Spain. They're the ones who made Spain what it is today. So for that reason, it was it was very important for Ferdinand and Isabella. But yeah, so the last kingdom had fallen, and now the Muslims were living under a Christian king and queen who had agreed to treat them nicely initially. They had agreed to treat them nicely.
initially. But well, before we get to what happened, and then we'll end with that. There's a story from the local Spain Spanish Muslim there, Spanish background, and he said there's a story. I don't know how true it is, but he said that Queen Elizabeth, she was known as the one with the yellow shirt. She had a white shirt, and she said she would not change her shirt, her blouse, until she conquered Granada. And they said she didn't shower, she didn't bathe, and which they say led to her eventual sickness and disease and death. Allah knows best. But the story is there that she refused to change her blouse until she conquered it.
Yeah, there's another similar thing that I've heard from not from lay people, but from historians themselves, and they say that she wasn't queen. It was Queen Isabella, and she said, "In my whole life, I've only taken a bath twice, and the first was the day I was born, and the second was the night before I got married." So, and people use this to compare the civilizations at the time. So this is the queen from the late 1400s who only bathed twice in her life, whereas in Cordoba in the year 900, so 600 years earlier, it was full of public baths.
Right.
The common person would go, and cleanliness was high up on the high up for everybody. It was full of libraries. For example, the library of Al-Hakam II, who is the second caliph of the Cordoba Caliphate, his library is said to have 500,000 books just in his library alone, which is far more than the rest of Europe combined. The rest of Europe maybe had 10,000, 15,000 books, something like that, not much. Wow. Whereas his personal library was 500,000. So when people hear Isabella narrate this about her bathing, and then they read about Cordoba 500 years before, they think, wow, you can see that this society was far, far ahead of its time, Islamic society in Spain. But unfortunately, due to all the political things that we've mentioned between the various factions, led to its fall.
Right. And the Muslims have the concept of wudu, right? Washing yourself before the prayer, right? And concept of bathing and cleanliness and being cleansed before you touch the Quran, the book, before you pray. So we have this concept, when you're junub, when you after having relations with your spouse, you're supposed to take a shower, and so we have this concept there. And so so as they were in the Dark Ages, and they were literally dying from disease, and not that many books, and you had huge flourishment of knowledge that was in the Andalus in Spain from the Muslims. You had huge agriculture, all the science that came out. I remember going to the museum right next to the Cordoba Masjid, and you can see in the museum all the tools that the different doctors had. They used, these are like modern day tools that were used in surgery today. And they were made during those times, and so much amazing things came out of that. And so coincidentally, you mentioned the year 1492, which is no stranger to us in the United States, where Christopher Columbus made his way to, the Western world, the New World, where he actually landed in Cuba first. And he even said when he got in Cuba, I remember reading the memoirs back in my college days, he wrote, "I landed in Cuba and I saw a mosque." So there were Muslims already making this journey. And, there's proof, and even from like the Muslims in a synagogue, they had, drawings and descriptions of them going to this other part of the world. And so coincidentally, that happens around the same time. And Christopher Columbus was known to like hang out around the masjid, be around the Muslims, learn from the Muslims, learn navigation from them. So what happens to the Muslims, and eventually they're fleeing, and as they're being persecuted. So they were told by the Queen and Ferdinand that you're going to be fine under our rule, but that's not what happened, right? Let's go into a little bit what happened, and we'll conclude, inshallah.
Just before we go into that, just for you Americans, guys, because I know I'm sitting here I'm in the UK, just to relate to, just to give you guys more of a link between America and Al-Andalus. When Ferdinand and Isabella actually were handed the keys of Granada, Christopher Columbus was around then. He was with them. It's Ferdinand and Isabella who are the ones who financed his journey from Spain to the New World to discover what the Native Americans had already discovered, and they were living if they're fine. So the link between America and Al-Andalus is very big. If you go to LA now, there's actually a place called Alhambra. There's actually an area in there's actually an area called the Alhambra. It's in I'm sure it's in Los Angeles. And then you got Toledo is another place in America. So yeah, a lot of the names come from this area. In America. You've got the Sierra Nevada mountains, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the Sierra Nevada mountains are the mountains which Granada was in. That's the name of the mountain range where the city of Granada is, which protected the Muslim kingdom from. So there's so many links between Al-Andalus and America, especially early on. But when Muhammad XII handed over the keys to Ferdinand and Isabella, part of the agreement was that I'll give you the keys to the city and you can take the city and you can control it. Just treat the Muslims well, allow them to be Muslim, allow them to go about their daily lives, and they'll be loyal to you. After about a few years, the authorities started harassing the Muslims, and the Muslims didn't like it, and they thought that Ferdinand and Isabella had broken the terms of the Treaty of Granada. So they thought, we don't have to be loyal to these people, so they rebelled. Ferdinand and Isabella thought, no, we haven't. They said, no, we haven't been bad to you. You're rebelling and you're breaking the terms of the treaty. So Ferdinand and Isabella said, this treaty is now null and void. You've broken it. We don't have to. You're not sticking to it. We don't have to stick to it. So they then decided that, we're not going to treat you well. You've all got to convert to Christianity. You've all got to leave Islam and become Christian.
Forced conversion.
Yeah. So basically, en masse, overnight, 250,000 Muslims had to become Christian. So as you can imagine, when something is done en masse and it's just done like that, in a second, they didn't really believe in Christianity. They still had a lot of iman in their hearts for Islam. So
I'm sorry if I might just strike a quick comparison. In our deen, our religion, Islam, it says la ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion. You can't compel or force anyone to anything. But they were doing this to the Muslims to force them into Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, conversely, when the Muslims came, they didn't force the Christians to become Muslim. And I was watching a documentary a few years ago on a British TV program, and a British historian was interviewing a Spanish historian about the Muslim period, and she said, all these people who converted from Christianity to Islam, was it for forced or how did they become? And the Spanish historian admitted, he goes, there's no evidence that there was any force. We don't have any suggestion to say there was any force anywhere. So yeah, the opposite happened when Ferdinand and Isabella conquered, after they conquered Granada. And so the Muslims started practicing Islam secretly in their houses. And then when they went out in public, they would pretend to be Christians. So they would go to church on Sunday. And when they got married, they'd have a ceremony in the church. But on Fridays, they'd pray Jumu'ah at home secretly. They'd be praying secretly at home. And the way they made their houses so the windows did not face the outside. They made the houses so it was all walls like this. And in the middle of the house, there was a courtyard, and the windows would face the courtyard in the middle, so no one could look into their house. So even if you go to Cordoba now, to Granada now, you will see houses like this, courtyard in the middle, no windows on the outside, so they can, in secret, they can get on with what they need to get on with. And interestingly, there was an article recently how they were digging in Granada in someone's house, and they came across a grave in the house. And when they looked at the grave, they found out these guys are being buried facing the Qibla. So even some people died. They didn't take them out to have a Christian burial. They buried them in their own house so they could give them an Islamic burial, be buried in the proper way. Wow. And this was found recently. So this went on for about 100 years, and eventually the Muslims retreated from the cities into the mountains, and they rebelled another once or twice more in the mountains in the 1560s, I think in the 1570s. And then eventually in the early 1600s, it was decided that these people, for about 100 years, they've shown they don't want to be Christian. They want to be Muslim. They're rebelling against us now. And they said, we're going to throw them all out of the country. So the final decree went out in 1609, I think. They're all Muslims who are now known as Moriscos. So you'll have heard the term Moor, which or Moros in Spanish, which they called the Muslims, and Morisco means little Muslims. So it was kind of a derogatory term that they called the Muslims after they conquered Granada. And they said all Morisco Muslims have to leave Spain. So a few 100,000 made their way to the south coast, and many of them boarded ships and ended up in North Africa. Recently, they found out that actually there's a few Muslims here and there who actually retreated to mountains here and there and lived in caves, and they kept their Islam for a few hundred years afterwards. But this is a very small minority. There's a few stories of Muslims who went to North Africa and they didn't like it. They wanted to go back to their home, and they came on ships back a few years later and then lived secretly. This is a kind of new histories which they're finding out now, but for the most part, the vast majority were thrown out, and that largely ended the Muslim presence in Spain in 1609. So they came in the year 711, and they left in 1609, which is nearly 900 years, nearly 1,000 years. Islam and Muslims were present on the Iberian Peninsula, modern day Spain and Portugal. If you compare that to America, America's only 250 years old. So if you put that into the mind of Al-Andalus, 900 years, 250 years, you get an idea of how how big and how strong the Islamic presence was.
Yeah, I think when you look at things from the broader perspective, relatively speaking, compared to other, superpowers and dynasties, it's the Muslims they're much longer. We're able to get a lot more accomplished. But there's definitely the fitna and the trials that one has to be aware of. And we hear of the tragic things, like they were forced to eat pork and forced to be Christian and killed, and children killed and thrown away. And I remember being with one of our friends there, and he's like, yeah, I come here, I've been here a couple of times, and it's just so sad. But I looked at it from an optimistic perspective, like, look what we're able to do when we come together, when we stand for justice, when we stand for Islam, we call to Allah. And, they didn't come with a sword. They came with, with the Dawah, calling to Allah, and they came with, trying to establish justice in the land, helping those who are oppressed. And they were able to accomplish so much, not just for themselves, but for the whole world. The knowledge that came out of there that continues to benefit society today. So I just want to thank you so much, Dr. aka Tariq Trekker. Check him out on YouTube. Very pleasure being with you. And like during that time, then we had a new rise, which was the rise of the empire, the Ottoman Empire, which was going on in the Balkans and Turkey, Turkey. And so I just want to say thank you so much for coming to the program. We did cover a lot.
Thank you for inviting me on. It was very enjoyable. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And Jazakallah khair for all those tuning in and watching. We hope you found it of benefit as well. Thank you for tuning in to iTVusa. You can watch it on the Yoku channel. Be sure to like and subscribe. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.